Okay, I did Langston Hughes for my AP Poet project, and that's him. James Mercer Langston Hughes was born February 1st, 1902, in Joplin, Missouri. Based on my research, he had a very unstable family setting where his parents divorced when he was young and his father moved to Mexico. He and his mother and his grandmother moved to Lincoln, Illinois, Cleveland, Ohio, and so he had a very transient childhood. He had a very unstable family slash early years part of his life. He joined his father in Mexico for a gap year before college after graduating high school. Of course, he went to Columbia University following this gap year, where he made his famous theme for English B poem, which is an amazing poem. He published his first book of poetry in 1924 titled The Weary Blues, and he was only 22 at the time, which is highly impressive. Good job. He then won the Harmon Gold Medal for Literature for his first book in 1930 titled Not Without Laughter. And of course, he was brought up and born into a very nuanced and very racist part of America, or time in America. Uh, this historical context is a very big part in his motivation for poetry and his writing style, which I'll talk to in this slide. So it's impossible to mention Langston Hughes without. It's impossible to mention the Harlem Renaissance without mentioning Langston Hughes, because of how influential and how he was involved in this circle of artists who were at the time considered new and hip and modern. Hughes is most known for his colorful, insightful portrayal of African Americans, and he was also often championing the outcasts of society, so the poor urban people, the minorities, the immigrants who didn't have a voice in modern America. And he was heavily influenced by jazz. Uh, that's coming from his involvement in the Harlem Renaissance community. Uh, in terms of his style, he was uh, giving a voice, per se, to the common experience of African Americans. So racial tensions, poverty, injustice, hopelessness. But he also liked to counteract this dark side of his culture by championing music and love of language and like laughter. And in doing so, he pictured the dark side of his culture, or like the sad or like hopeless part of his culture, by balancing it out with this like colorful and lighthearted spirit that he found within his own culture. Instead of being complicated and complex, he used themes and language that regular people could understand. And that again ties back into his goal in trying to give a voice to the common experience of African Americans. Then, of course, he became a little communist, a little proletariat, unfortunately. uh, but he did so because he saw this political idea or idealism as a way to counteract racism. Um, he had many critics as well from the African American community because they thought that he was picturing the dark side of their culture, like the ugly side, but in reality, he was just giving them or people the reality of what their situation was like during this time. He had a few influences. Whitman, Sandburg, and Dunbar were the three people mentioned in my research. There's also rumor going around that he had a secret love affair with Whitman, um, because, well, partly he was very closed, very private with his sexuality. Uh, but he also shared a lot of similar structure with these poets because he was very simple, but he was also very purposeful in his writing. He influenced, of course, a lot of prominent African American leaders like MLK during the Civil Rights era, and he also probably influenced Toni Morrison because they share like this theme of uh, like community and richness in your community, which I will talk about in my poem. Okay, so I chose Night Funeral in Harlem for my poem. If you guys just want to read this poem to yourselves, just pause the video and then come back because I'll have a lot of annotations and notes I want to say. So the first word "knights," I said that this had a racial implication to it, where it's like the society that's not in the limelight, or like the outcast of society. Harlem, of course, is a setting of which this funeral is at, and this is a center a for impoverished African Americans in New York City. With the line "them two fine cars," I mentioned that he was driven away in the nicest cars he's ever been driven in, which is a bit ironic because he was dead. And this right here, "insurance man did not pay," this stanza right here, I mentioned that he found wealth in his community rather than like the traditional aspects of wealth, which is, cold hard cash. Because at the end of the day, his community was there to offer him or provide for his funeral, and made it as nice as possible, as their own financial abilities were able to make. Um, I skipped to this part right here. So this poor boy, he made a sacrifice for his friend, um, and he himself was poor. So that again shows like the connection to a community. And then this right here, when they meet their ends, I mention or say that people are expecting the same treatment for their own funeral and their own death, which comes back to the community. That main theme of community. Um, his diction with "black boy," which is first mentioned here. Where'd it go? Right here, "black boy" portrays a sense of innocence. And charged $5 his girlfriend had to pay. Right here. Oh, no, right here. So I said that this is like the cost of heaven, or like the cost of entry to heaven. They saw it as important to have a preacher there, and of course, the person dying, he's leaving behind this his girlfriend is and his friend who are there to send him away. I then mentioned this part of parallelism, which does a good job of highlighting and emphasizing all the stuff that his community was able to offer him and provide him for his funeral. And the Black Hearse done sped. Hearse, SOS, Song of Solomon vibes, the dead hearse, the overall shared theme of, is it better to be financially independent and like wealthy, with the sacrifice of not having a strong community behind you? And this is definitely portrayed in this poem. With the street light, I said this light had a couple of purposes. One was to illuminate his funeral, and illuminate what's going on in Harlem at this time. But it's also a symbol, like a star, for example, or like a heavenly symbol to which he is kind of sent away. Like he becomes the star in the heavens, for example. Of course, shine just like a tear, that boy that they was mourning. So yeah, they're mourning, they're sad. And finally, this last part right here is what ties it all together, where they made his funeral grand and made it as good as possible, in the limitations of their financial standings. So overall, this poem is about community. It's about having people behind you that love you, respect you, and even though you might be poor financially, you are probably still rich in friends and family and girlfriends and all that. So thank you guys.